All right, welcome back. I'm Danielle Smith. Some of you know me from politics, but for the last 5 years, I've been the host on 770 CHQR of the Danielle Smith Show. And our first panel discussion, I've got 3 to do today. Our first panel discussion is going to be dealing with news of the day. I think we'd all hoped that we'd know by now who the U.S. president would be. I don't think anyone's had the courage to call it yet, so we're going to have to probably start by getting on the same page about the same set of facts, because this is part of the problem that we're facing, is everybody starts with their own preconceptions. So I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from on this, and then we'll get into a discussion with our panelists. So this segment is U.S. election results. What does it mean for Canada, and what does it mean for Conservatives? Our panelists are going to be John Fund. We're having a little bit of trouble finding him. I hope we get him online soon. He is the National Review National Affairs columnist. If he does arrive when we start the panel discussion, we'll go to him first to get the latest on what's going on in the U.S. We also have Todd. Many of you will know him as a longtime advisor to various politicians, but he currently has been appointed as the representative in Washington for the Ontario government. And our own Sonya Savage, who had a long history in pipeline politics with Enbridge, with the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, and now is Alberta's energy minister. So we've got lots to talk about with all of these panelists. Let me again, just by starting off talking about the same set of facts, many of you, I don't know how closely you follow U.S. politics. I just began following it very closely in the past 4 years. I know the Electoral College is really confusing. And the way I kind of look at it is it's kind of weird because the state drives it. It's almost like giving Jason Kenney or Doug Ford the power to set the rules that elect Justin Trudeau. So if you frame it in that way, you can understand why it is so fraught with political divides. But let me tell you how I'm approaching this. I should put it on the table that I wanted Donald Trump to win. I know that's rare to hear from somebody in the mainstream media, but for a lot of reasons, which we'll get into on this panel discussion, I think that the issue on Keystone XL pipeline, fracking, and his stance on freedom and trying to get us out of the COVID mess would have put us in a better position. But I accept that Joe Biden will probably win it. And here's a few of the reasons why. I think one of the issues that we saw is around mail-in ballots. Gosh, I hope America fixes that problem, where they take the Florida model and count all of the mail-in ballots first so that you know on election night where your state stands. I think that's at the root of a lot of their problems. But in the discussions I've done, it's really hard to tamper with mail-in ballots. They've got QR codes, they've got watermarks, they've got a number of different provisions. So I'm satisfied it's pretty difficult to do that. It'll also be really hard to manufacture millions of fake votes across multiple jurisdictions. In the analysts I've spoken with, they also say that when recounts occur, recounts normally affirm what the original vote had to say in the first place. And so I wouldn't anticipate, especially with Joe Biden taking the lead in most of the turn states, I wouldn't expect it to change that much. That being said, the state's rules around elections seem to dominate. And there are 2 things that I'm watching. I'll just put it out there for you. There was apparently a computer glitch in Michigan that was announced on Friday that had 6,000 votes for Trump somehow turned to Biden. So when those got corrected on a recount, it turned out Trump won that county. There's also 47 other counties that are now being looked at as a recount for that reason. And that particular computer programming system operates in 30 of the states, including all of the swing states. So that's something I'm watching. I don't know if that will change the outcome, but that may put some things in, that may also explain why we're waiting to get into the final count on who won. And then there's also a court case in Pennsylvania, and it looks like Donald Trump won in at least getting the votes that appeared after 8 o'clock on election night put into a separate tally, so they have to be counted separately. So just know I'm watching all of that. But here, that's a long way of saying I'm anticipating Joe Biden in the White House, the Democrats to hold the House, but by a smaller margin, and the Senate to be Republican. And so we're just going to now get into our discussion about what that's going to mean for us, what that's going to mean for the world. I'm just going to double check and see if we've got John Fund with us yet, to see if we can go to him. No, not yet. Okay, well, that's fine. We'll start off talking to Ian Todd, because Ian is, as I mentioned, Ontario's representative in Washington for the Ontario government. He's been watching this really closely. Let's start by asking him, just to sort of set the stage, if there's anything I've said, Ian, that you disagree with and you want to reset on, if you think it's likely to turn out the way that I've just described, please tell me. If you think it's still very much in doubt, tell me too, because that'll guide our discussion. Go ahead, Ian.
Thank you, Danielle, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from the United States. Really dull and boring times down here. Not a lot going on. It's, that's what I like to tell my Canadian friends. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this session, and it's a privilege to join Sonya and hopefully John this morning in the discussion. Perhaps I don't disagree with anything you've said, Danielle. I think you've got it right. Funnily enough, Americans aren't really phased, as odd as it seems to us, they're not really phased by this process. It's not unusual for this type of delay and uncertainty. But as Canadians, we tend to look at it as a very odd process, but they're not phased by it at all down here, it seems. But I'd like to just take a moment regarding Ontario's presence in the United States, just to hopefully bring this perspective to the discussion this morning. As you mentioned, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I was posted to this position 2 years ago. I've had the privilege of traveling to over 40 states in the last 2 years. And my office is located in the Canadian Embassy. Again, just a real privilege to be there. And I'm thrilled to have my new neighbor is James Rajat, the representative for Alberta. And I'm just thrilled to have another Canadian conservative with me in Washington. I focus primarily on federal engagement on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, senators, their key staff, and the White House administration. I also spend a great deal of time at the subnational level working with governors' offices. We're getting a lot of work done at that level, and it's been very effective for us. In addition, though, to the DC office, Ontario has offices in New York, Chicago, Dallas, and San Francisco. Those are the trade and investment offices that are primarily focused on attracting U.S. business to Ontario and helping Ontario companies expand into these U.S. markets. But briefly, again, just to bring it to perspective, Ontario's trading relationship with the United States, a lot of people don't know this, but if Ontario were a standalone country, we would be the third largest trading partner to the U.S. It's very, very significant. We're the number one trading partner to 19 states, and we're the number two trading partner to 9 additional states. And last in 2019, Ontario's two-way trade with the U.S. was over $301 billion US dollars. So a really significant contributor to the economy there. Of course, our big trading partners are Michigan, New York, Ohio, Texas, and California. Again, we have to remind ourselves when it comes to California, the 5th largest economy in the world, that state. It's just a massive amount of business that we do with them. But we also do a lot of trade with states such as Indiana, Kentucky, Georgia, Florida, and Washington State. And with my American friends, I like to describe Ontario as the workshop of Canada. Our manufacturing, as we all know, is unrivaled. Over 200 million consumers live within a day's delivery by truck or rail from our province. And Ontario accounts for more than half of the two-way trade or merchandise traded between Canada and the U.S. So hopefully I bring that perspective to the discussion. We've got a great story to tell. We're so lucky to have them as our neighbors. I can't say that enough. We're just very fortunate.
All right, thank you so much for that, Ian. I should just also mention somebody was muffling their mic as you were talking. I don't know if that was Sonya or if that was you, Ian, but I just make note to be aware of that while you're talking. As I mentioned, Sonya Savage is also with us as well, Energy Minister for Alberta. Minister, I'd love to get your take as well on the U.S. election, if you see it playing out differently than I described or as Ian described. And maybe also just if you could go through, I thought it was really helpful for Ian to give us some idea of the amount of volume of trade between Alberta and the U.S. and who the principal states are that we do trade with. Let me hand it over to you, Minister.
Well, thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Ian. Ian's down in Washington, D.C. with our representative, James Rajat, newly appointed James Rajat. as well, we have trade offices in other key markets, including Houston. I guess I come from the place looking at the trade relationship with the United States also. Alberta, mostly, we ship 3.8 million barrels a day. Canada ships 3.8 million barrels a day of oil into the United States. That's 58% of all U.S. imports of oil. We ship 2.5 million barrels a day into PADD 2, which is in the central United States, and 500,000 barrels a day already into the Gulf Coast. Of course, you've heard a lot about pipelines, the importance of KXL. We've also got Enbridge's Line 3 replacement project, and we've got Enbridge's Line 5 that are important, and we're following very closely. So I'm not going to wade in and predict what's going to happen in the U.S. election as they go through their process, but I can tell you that we are following extremely closely because we are such an integrated energy market between Canada and the United States. They need our energy products as much as we need their markets to ship to. So I can't underemphasize how important this is for our country. And that's why we put James Rajat down there. I can't think of a more qualified and skilled person to join Ian down in Washington as we navigate through this following the election, as we navigate through some of the policies that a Biden administration could put in place, as we navigate what the Senate will look like, and particularly the trade relationship between our two countries. So I can't emphasize how important this is to Alberta and how closely we are following it.
Okay, thank you for that, Minister. I recognize that we have to make certain assumptions going into this discussion. Otherwise, it's going to appear a bit disjointed. So I'm going to make an assumption. Maybe we should talk about the potential for Donald Trump to be president first, if it turns out that way. I think we have a pretty known quantity there. We had our battle over the USMCA or the CUSMA or whatever it is that the proper acronym is to use. I try to call it the new NAFTA in order to avoid putting one country ahead of the other. But it seems to me like we've resolved a lot of our issues there. If we have Donald Trump in the White House, we know where the trade tensions are going to be. They're going to continue to be around softwood lumber, continue to be around dairy, continue to be around steel, continue to be around aluminum. And we also know that this integrated energy partnership that we have in North America, including Keystone XL pipeline and the development of fracking and LNG, would continue at a slow pace, because it is always slow, but at least we know it would continue. So I would anticipate that if Donald Trump remains in the White House, we won't have too much uncertainty. Ian, let me put it to you. Is there anything on the horizon that we might see us having additional tensions in our relationship? Or do you think that the Canada-U.S. relationship has been pretty well resolved and has some stability right now under a Trump administration?
Sure. No, I think you're quite right. And we've developed a great working relationship with Ambassador Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and that's gone very, very well. But no, you're quite right. There, as we all know, there will be tensions ongoing. It's just the nature of the relationship, of the friendship. But no, with the Trump administration, we have those relationships well developed now, and that works to our advantage for sure.
Minister, can you comment on that as well, about from the Alberta perspective? It does strike me there's a lot more uncertainty and risk with a Joe Biden presidency than a Trump presidency, but maybe you can tell us if there's additional worries we'd have if Trump continued on in the White House.
Sure. We've with the Trump administration, we've had 4 years of knowing where it's going. He's focused on supporting the oil and gas sector. I think we know what's there. It's more uncertainties with Joe Biden's platform. I think we're pretty well aware of where Donald Trump stands. We know KXL pipeline has a solid supporter in the Trump administration. So you're right. I don't think there's too many surprises and uncertainties if there was a Trump administration. Okay,
so let's talk about the, I think, more likely outcome of a President Joe Biden. Now, I was really surprised to see that in the wake of all this uncertainty, the stock market seems to be fine. My stocks, although they're a mixed bag, generally seem to improve over this past week. And the analysis that I've seen on that is that the biggest loser in this race has been demonstrated to be the Democrats. They were bragging about having a supermajority in the Senate, filibuster proof. They were bragging about being able to extend the number of their majority in the House. And in fact, it looks like the Republicans will hold the Senate, and they've gained some seats in the House of Representatives. So I wonder, Ian, if you can tell us how that plays out, because we always focus so much on the occupant of the White House, but so much of what happens in the U.S. happens either at the state level, as we've learned, especially through COVID, or because of the dynamic between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So in some ways, if you have that mixture, what does that mean for the kind of agenda that would be able to get pushed through over the next 4 years if it is a Biden presidency?
Well, there's no question uncertainty and gridlock will continue to be the mainstay in Washington for the foreseeable future. And that's why we're focusing a great deal of effort at that subnational level, working with governors and again, getting a great deal of work done there. But to your point, on this campaign, obviously incumbency mattered. But both campaigns really achieved their goals, and it was quite impressive to see that Trump campaign turn out nearly 10 million more supporters during a pandemic. I have to say, in my travels over the last year, even during this pandemic, on the ground, it's just been impressive to see that campaign and the amount of work that they did. I have to. It's by no means scientific, and it clearly isn't, given the results. But Trump signage on the ground was 10-1 in virtually every state I went to, which was a little interesting sidebar.
Yeah, no kidding. Let me then go back to Sonya on that. Sorry, Minister, I shouldn't be so informal with you. Let me go back to Minister Savage.
I've known you for decades.
I know it has been, literally. Let me get you to respond to the same thing. It seems like the markets and investors kind of like gridlock, which is very strange. In our system, we tend to like majority government so that we know what a clear direction will be over the next 4 years. But is there a potential for an advantage if that's the case, if there's a Biden presidency?
Well, I think a Senate, a Republicans majority Senate, will temper some of the platform items that Joe Biden had in his platform. There's a lot in there that we're following closely. He's committed to net zero. He's committed to decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035. We're not sure how he will do that and what that will mean for natural gas. He's committed to a border carbon adjustment for products coming across the border from jurisdictions that don't have the same climate policies. We're not sure how that would apply. He's committed to methane regs, clean fuel standards. There's uncertainty on fracking and no leases on public lands. We're following that very closely and what it means for Canada. Of course, the pipeline issue, we're following that extremely closely. And his commitment to spend up to $2 trillion on transition off of fossil fuels. Who pays for that? What does that mean? Will there be expectations that Canada goes along? He's got a lot of big policy commitments to electric vehicles, electrification of the transportation sector. I think there was even a commitment in there to transition all school buses, all 500,000 school buses, to non-combustion engines within 5 years. How much is that going to cost? So we're following that carefully with an understanding that some of these policies are going to have to be tempered within the Senate. We're also following, and this is my background, why I'm following it closely, what does he do with the agencies, the regulators like FERC? He has appointments that he can make to FERC, and will it be politicized? Will there be a climate agenda put into FERC? So we're following that really carefully, and I think watching, with a Republican-dominated Senate, some of those policies will be much more difficult for him to put through.
All right. I don't know if we're going to get John Fund with us today. He was the National Review National Affairs columnist that I was going to be asking some of these political questions to. So, Minister, if you want to pass on any of these, by all means that you can. I bet because you've been a political watcher for so long, you have an opinion, but I recognize the position that you're in. But it might be up to Ian Todd to tell us what the heck happened down there, because I am sort of surprised, as you mentioned, 10-to-1 signs for Donald Trump on the ground. You had massive rallies of the size I've never seen before, turning out to Trump and not turning out to Biden. I guess I'm just trying to understand how freaked out people were about COVID. That's the only thing I can really pin that to, is that perhaps there was an underestimation that the people who were the most terrified of COVID were the ones who were ordering the mail-in ballots, and they were the ones for whom the Biden message about lockdowns and mandatory mask mandates really resonated. It's a bit strange for us because we've got a really free environment in Alberta. I think our Premier Jason Kenney is allowed for the most freedom of any of the provinces. Ontario remains in lockdown in Toronto, Peel, and Ottawa, as I understand it. And so there is a real difference across the country. Maybe you can tell us about that COVID aspect, because I think that affects all of us. If we do have a U.S. national lockdown or a U.S. national mandate or a U.S. increasing border restrictions as a result of responding to that fear, that's going to overshadow everything we've talked about so far. So Ian, give me your take on it. What the heck happened?
Well, I think you're right, but it's obviously going to play out over the next couple of months. I've found in my travels that it really varies state to state, and you know, obviously the restrictions vary as well. But just on the ground, how people have been reacting to it really varies. From it's the contrast between
Is he here now?
Oklahoma and Arkansas compared to New York or Michigan. It's really quite different. But I think in terms of the turnout and the mail-in balloting, you're quite right that was the reaction.
Credible should we take his positions that he would impose? Again, his positions change. Let's acknowledge that, especially on fracking. I've seen all kinds of videos where he said, yes, we're going to end fracking. And then, of course, he denied it all the way through. So he has positions, and he's a 47-year politician. So he understands when he has to be flexible. But I don't even know if he has the power to do some of the things that he's described. Does he have the power to do a national lockdown? Does he have the power to do a national mandate? Or is all of that really driven at the state level? Can you sort of shed some light on that, Ian?
It's mainly driven at the state level. He'll certainly and has made his opinions known. But yes, it's driven at the state level, and it's such a big and complicated country. And again, it varies drastically from region to region. That's what's so fascinating about it. But again, and fortunately, our supply chains have remained strong and intact. But border issues are a real issue for us, and the free flow of goods and traffic. That's going to have a big impact over the next coming months.
Well, let me put it to you, Minister, as well. I think we've got Chris Butler from Americans for Tax Reform. We're going to see if we can get him to fill in for John Fund to give us a little bit more of an American perspective on this as well. So stand by. I'll stop asking you uncomfortable questions in just a couple minutes, Minister. But maybe you can frame your answer in giving us some sense of how your government is assessing this COVID risk. How are you assessing the potential risk of more lockdowns in the U.S., mask mandates in the U.S., continued border closure? For those who haven't been following very closely the pilot project that is happening in Alberta to try to allow for rapid testing to get people back home through the airport as well as through the Coots border crossing, that might you might want to, if you have any early results from that as a bit of a glimmer of hope about how we might finally get our economies back reintegrated, that might be a helpful context too. Minister?
Sure. Well, we're trying to, of course, balance the public safety risk, we're following the advice of Dr. Dina Hinshaw, our Chief Medical Officer, but recognizing that we want to, part of recovering and part of getting through COVID is making sure we have a healthy economy, keeping people working, keeping people mentally healthy. And I think the pilot project at the airport is a prime example of being able to have people be able to travel and shorten their isolation times. So we're watching the United States very carefully, how they're managing COVID. I think as with what Ian had said, this election, there was a lot of unpredictables. as people weren't voting necessarily on policy or even ideology. They were in a very polarized environment. It was very much on personality, but very much on different views around COVID as well. I like to think that people vote based on policy, and from my perspective on energy policy. But obviously, in the United States, there's a lot more complicating. It's very polarized. COVID came in, personality came in.
Okay, we will spend some time talking about what energy policy will look like. I don't want to make it all about Alberta energy policy, although that's a pretty important aspect. There's obviously a huge aspect as well with the development in the auto sector and the green fuel standards and what that's going to mean there too. But I gather that we've got Chris Butler on the line. He is with Americans for Tax Reform. He's filling in for John Fund. And this is where I wanted to begin, is to try to get an American perspective on what's going on down there, what the likelihood is that any of the legal challenges and the recounts that Donald Trump is initiating will be successful, or if he agrees with my opening premise that what's more likely is it'll be a Biden presidency, reconfirmed on recount, Democrat House of Representatives, and a Republican Senate. Chris, thanks so much for sparing some time with us at the last minute. I sure appreciate it. Maybe you could just...
Yeah, sure thing.
Why don't we just sort of start with you either agreeing or disagreeing with me? Because we've been talking on the basis of a likely Biden presidency and what that would mean for us. Is that how we should be proceeding on this?
Yeah, I think that it's what seems to be most likely is that overwhelmingly most likely is that we will have a Biden administration. There are too many things that need to flip the right way for Trump in order to try to pull it out from a legal perspective. And the challenges so far have been based on things that create the appearance of something going wrong, like inappropriate following of observation criteria, things like that. There hasn't been any actual wrongdoing that's been clearly illustrated so far. So, and the allegations don't seem like they're enough to swing enough electoral votes in Trump's direction.
Can I, before you leave that, can you just address this issue that came up yesterday? Because I've been following this, and I don't know where I should put this in the category of probably not a big deal or might be a really big deal. It's this this Antrim County recount where there was a glitch in the computer program by the Dominion company that was providing the services that switched 6,000 votes that were in the Republican camp, switched them to Democrat, and then on a manual recount switched back, and Trump won the county. I guess they've called for now 47 additional counties using that technology to do a recount, and I guess those machines are also in 30 other states. Is that a thing, or is it not a thing?
Well, the only thing I know is what you've said.
Okay.
Basically, is what I've read in the newspaper. So, I think it's probably actually is a glitch, but I don't. You'd think there would be more fingerprints if there were a concerted effort across such a wide variety of states. I think that there are the things that go on are subtle things that happen during door-to-door canvassing that they tend to predate the kind of election irregularities that we see tend to predate the counting process, and they occur during door-to-door events. They occur during providing ballots to people, to collecting those ballots. They don't tend to occur during that phase of things. Historically, what we've seen in some of these big cities that have experienced corruption problems, they don't seem to fit that pattern. This is just my personal opinion that it's not likely to be able to swing things. I could be wrong, of course. It's really, really difficult to find out what's actually going wrong because, the press is just completely in the tank for the Democrats and has a hostility toward Trump that knows no bounds whatsoever. So it's extremely difficult to find out with any objective degree of truth what is actually going on. So I think we just have to have some confidence in the legal process that things like this this glitch will be evaluated at the end of the day. I'm sure we'll find more. I think in the recount in Georgia could really change, the statewide recount really change a lot in Georgia. You had mentioned the Senate. I think it's pretty likely that we're going to have a Republican Senate. As you all probably know, we're looking at probably having a recount, excuse me, not a recount, but a runoff election in Georgia, January 5th, for both of those two Senate seats that were up for election in Georgia. And as folks might know, one of those was a special election. That's why we had two Senate elections going on simultaneously in Georgia.
Can you explain, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you explain why would there be a runoff? Is it because it's so close?
Well, yes, it's because it's so close, but also because Georgia law requires that you have a majority. And so there were, in the special election, there were two Republicans in the primary who had split the vote, and it was expected that that would go to a runoff. The one that was a bit more surprising was the Purdue race, where he achieved something like 49.7 or 8%, something like that, because of some extremely minor third-party candidates that were on the ballot, primarily. So that could potentially change during the recount. He could achieve his 50% during the recount because it's such a small margin. You just don't know which way it will go. But it looks like it's likely that there will be a runoff in both cases, and those minor parties will not be there because neither one of them is the top two candidates. So it's guaranteed that somebody will make 50%, of course.
Okay.
In that case.
Can I ask you to comment a bit on the process? And, you know, we Canadians just love to criticize. Obviously, we've got our own problems here, but it does seem to me to be bananas that you would have individual states determining the rules to choose the president. The way I've described it to our audience, it's like our premier in Alberta, Jason Kenney, who's conservative, and our premier in Ontario, Doug Ford, who's conservative, choosing the rules for how we're going to choose our Liberal prime minister. Of course you're going to have problems. So that would be one thing I'd like you to comment on. Is there any appetite to change the way the vote occurs? But number two, more importantly, why can't everyone do it like Florida? I mean, it was lovely that they started the count on the mail-in ballots early. Then we had a result on election night, because it strikes me we wouldn't be having this discredit. I mean, I think there's a real danger that institutions will be discredited having seen all of these after the fact votes come in, flipping all of these seats. I worry that America is going to end up with long-term problems in restoring confidence in the electoral system. Why not just have a rule? Got to have your ballot in before we start counting. We're going to count it first, and then we'll know on election night. Any chance that's going to happen?
Yeah, I think you will see some significant reforms in the process of the elections and the counting. One thing to bear in mind is that the reason Florida is so clean and so easy and so good is because they were the reason that we went through this the last time in 2000. And so if there's one state that's going to get it right now, it's going to be Florida. But Florida also has been pretty much a one-party state for a while now. I mean, Republicans have controlled the governor's mansion and both houses of the Florida legislature for, I think, 8 years now, something like that. So one-party states tend to get it right because they don't get thrown off the rails by who's going to get the advantage or not so much. And, you know, ironically, or not ironically, but coincidentally, it's the swing states. Not coincidentally either, I guess, but it's the swing states that, you know, they have these divided governments that make it very difficult to alter anything. In fact, a lot of the reason that we're seeing a lot of these problems now is because these states had in place frameworks that were not able to accommodate the massive mail by vote or the massive vote by mail effort that was underway, ostensibly because of COVID-19. But the reality is that the Democrats knew that they had a significant enthusiasm gap, and they made a calculation that they could mitigate their significant enthusiasm gap by massively deploying mail-in balloting, by making it as extremely easy as possible for people to vote, and by enabling other people to help other people vote by taking people ballots, helping people to get ballots. One of the Soros-funded entities, George Soros-funded entities in the United States, sent people mail in about a dozen states to every registered voter that said well, actually, not every registered voter. They selected geographical areas that were likely to return for Democrats. But they sent them mail that looked like it was from the government. That said, and it said at the cross like Voter Information Center or something like that, and which was the name of their nonprofit that they established for this purpose. And you open it up, and inside there's a form that looks very official, and it says, complete the attached form in order to be sent your ballot. But what they'd sent actually was the absentee ballot application that they'd printed off of the appropriate websites that the government ran. And they had enclosed it in the envelope with this cover letter from the Voter Information Center and made it appear as if, oh, the government has sent you, here's your information about how you vote and ballot. That's the kind of soft corruption that we experienced. I mean, it was before Election Day. And how do you, I don't think there's anything that you can do about that now. I mean, it's illegal, it's underhanded, it smells funny, and a lot of people are deceived by it. But that's the kind of mess that was created here. I mean, none of these states were prepared for this kind of mail-in balloting. And the accommodations that were made by the legal system rather than through the appropriate legislative process. And that's what has generated so much chaos.
All right.
See, John Fund has joined, and
hold on.
he
Wait.
knows much more about this than
He
I
does.
do.
He does, Chris. This is where I do my breaking news stinger. Apparently, Joe Biden has just declared himself president. He has been declared president. And so, John, that's why John Fund was not available for to talk to us earlier. So, John, thanks so much for joining us. Once again, as I mentioned, John Fund is the National Review National Affairs columnist. John, tell us what went down. Who declared him president? Because it seemed like there was that problem with Arizona, with Fox calling it earlier, as well as Associated Press, but other media not. So is this now the consensus? Is Joe Biden president?
Well, the consensus of certain media outlets, yes. The votes are still being counted in almost every state. In some states, 10% of the vote is still to be counted. But the media's decision desks, which are made up of pollsters, data analysts, nerd geniuses, they every year make a decision based on the votes that have come in. And 98% of the time, they're correct. So I'm not going to challenge their call. I do challenge some of the vote procedures and the sloppy mechanisms by which we got here. I think a previous speaker referenced those. But I think that the consensus will now be that Joe Biden will win enough states to win 270 electoral votes. He clearly has already won the popular vote. Okay, so let me then get you to comment a little bit more on this, John. We had an earlier conversation with Energy Minister Sonya Savage and Ian Todd, who is Ontario's representative in Washington, and we will return to the Canadian implications of this. But let me just go back and forth again between you and Chris for a minute. John, give us your take on what happened, what went wrong, because I guess I had an analyst, Wendy Schiller, on who said that COVID was a bigger issue than the president was considering. And if he lost, it was because terrified seniors didn't think he was taking it seriously enough. And that surprised me a bit because we just saw so many massive rallies for Donald Trump. I'm wondering if that was a deciding factor, or if it was his, how did they describe it, coming out hot on the first election debate. If Trump 2.0 from the second debate had been that person showing restraint and calmness and presidential demeanor, if he'd done that in the first round, would that have made a difference? That's not Donald Trump. That's
yeah,
not
truly.
Donald Trump.
So tell me, what do you think? What was the determining factor? Why did Joe Biden take it?
An election this close, you can point to any number of 20 factors and say they were the deciding factor. Close elections like this, you can point to almost anything. If I had to point to one thing, I think the lost opportunity in the first debate where you had 80 million Americans watching, which is very rare in our fragmented media environment. And Donald Trump pursued a curious strategy of trying to so intimidate and bully Joe Biden that he thought that Biden would break underneath the pressure. And when that didn't happen, Trump didn't have a plan B. He then, I think, foolishly allowed himself to be canceled out of the second debate, again lost an opportunity to repair the damage that he had done in the first debate, and then in the third debate he behaved himself and acquitted himself well, but that was 2 lost opportunities and 1 save at the end. So as for the COVID, Trump carried or tied seniors according to the exit poll. You may not read that very much or hear about that very much, but Trump had a late surge. And I think the biggest thing that Canadians should understand, because I think this impacts your politically correct politics as well, Glenn Bolger and Scott Rasmussen, who are 2 very reputable pollsters, report that 19%, let me repeat, 19% of Trump supporters were leery and wary and unwilling to let their friends, neighbors, co-workers, or even relatives know how they were voting. The polling industry in the United States is broken, and it's broken in part because the polls are now identified with media outlets that have lost credibility and legitimacy among many voters. And that's why there's the growth of alternative media in Canada, such as your program. And as a result, if people don't talk to the pollsters, they don't believe that they're fair brokers, and they don't believe that the polls are going to be used properly, you're going to find a very difficult time with a pollster accurately surveying people at the state level. And as you know, because of the Electoral College, the state level polls are what counts. So the polls nationally were not that far off, but in individual states, there was a second failure in a row. And I think the polling industry in the United States and by extension in Canada is in crisis.
Yeah, and I'll just give one example. In Michigan, one of the mainstream polls suggested that Biden was ahead by 17 percentage points.
That was Wisconsin, by the way, not Michigan. Wisconsin.
But Trafalgar said it was a dead tie, and it turned out that Trafalgar was right, and the mainstream one was wrong. And
Trafalgar had a good year this year, but they had some errors as well. But their model clearly is predicated on the fact that there is a shy Trump voter, there's a shy conservative voter who frankly is tired of being called deplorable, racist, sexist, homophobic, and all those other things. And they are highly unwilling to let people know their political views. And if they shield them from even their own family, it shouldn't be surprising pollsters can't pick that up.
Yeah, I should just mention, I am in the mainstream media. I know it's very unusual to have someone in the mainstream media declare openly that they wanted Donald Trump to win, so I can see why you thought I might have been in the alt media.
Well, you are a courageous exception to the rule I just cited.
Let me then ask Chris Butler to comment on what you just heard John say, because I think that's what people are trying to understand is how does that enthusiasm for Donald Trump not translate into a win? Do you agree with some of the things that he identified as the missteps, or would you identify something else?
Well, I think the enthusiasm, one thing that is important to bear in mind is that Donald Trump got the second most votes of any presidential candidate in American history. The only person that surpassed him was Joe Biden this time. The enthusiasm for President Trump was actually extraordinary. He inspired a reaction, a visceral reaction in so many people that were so motivated and so egged on by the media that they were able to generate a surprisingly large amount of turnout against him. I wouldn't say that, I don't know how much of it was for Joe Biden, but I think a very small portion of it was. And you can see that in what happened in the down ballot races. I think we had some record, I can't quote the numbers to you right now, but in many of the swing states, we had a record number of people that voted for president for Joe Biden and then just simply skipped the rest of their ballot. They went in, they voted for Joe Biden, and they couldn't be bothered to vote in any of the other races. And this is why, in a lot of cases, Republican senators perform very well. And I think it's gonna help out a lot, Republicans down ballot for that reason. Which brings me to something that Canadians may not have been focused on as well, that I just like to point out, which is that at the state level and looking at as we were talking about the relationship between the state and federal government in the United States. In 2021, we will do redistricting in the United States because we've completed our census. So we'll be assigning legislative districts. The states will assign the legislative districts for federal elections for the House of Representatives. And Republicans did so much better than anybody expected at the state level in particular, and at both of the state legislatures and in the gubernatorial races, that Republicans will absolutely control the process of redistricting. Because in the majority of states that Republicans don't control, the legislative process, it's done by some sort of bipartisan or supposedly nonpartisan commission. And so what's going to happen is that when you combine the redistricting effect at the state level that is created by these down ballot successes that Republicans enjoyed, you combine that with the modest gains, surprising but modest gains that Republicans made in the U.S. House of Representatives, you see that there really is a very strong path for Republicans taking the House of Representatives in 2022. I think the even money will be on it.
Yeah, Chris, it's such a great point, and I want to get John to comment on that too. We're talking all very calmly, as if this is going to get resolved peacefully, but I must say we Canadians are watching with great alarm as you've got two different polar opposites, the Proud Boys on the one hand and Antifa on the other, who show up at rallies wanting to smash heads, break down doors and burn things down. And so I think there is a genuine concern, maybe you can alleviate our concerns, that no one's going to accept the result of this election and that there's a potential for it to really escalate. I don't know if it gets to the point where you're talking civil war in some states.
No,
but dude, put it into perspective for us, John.
No. A week ago, this was at least something you could argue about. But what has happened since Tuesday, if there are any incidents at all, they're isolated and have quickly been dealt with. The Proud Boys were never really militia, armed to the teeth that was going to go into the streets. That was left-wing propaganda. Antifa says it's a disorganized, unplanned group of people who want to fight fascism, but we all know that they are paid by people who direct their efforts and who can control them if they wish. Now that Biden has been declared the winner by the networks, you're not going to see them protest. What are they going to protest? They're going to protest perhaps if Joe Biden turns out to be far more moderate than they want, and that may be a separate issue once he becomes president. But, I understand that peaceful, placid Canadians who have a very admirable political culture of politeness look at us as often a chaotic mess, but it's not quite that bad. We've gotten through the last few days in remarkable good order. There have been incidents that need to be explained. There's potential fraud allegations that should be explored. We need to recognize how COVID was used to change our election system from a traditional voting at the polling place to all-mail voting and all of the attendant confusion and chaos that created. We have some challenges, but our democracy has stood this test very, very well. And the one thing that we have to understand, we have, as Chris Butler mentioned, we have the highest voter turnout in our history since 1900. That's the health of a democracy. That's not a democracy that's in crisis.
Okay, maybe I should get Chris to respond to that too. Do you agree that the temperature is going to be brought down, or do you think it's going to get amped up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the fact that that Democrats are talking about that they'll send in the troops to remove Donald Trump or something like that is just absurd. I mean, it's going to It took Al Gore 36 days to concede the election in 2000. We're nowhere close to something like that, So when the time comes when unless he makes a lot of progress and his unexpected progress and the legal challenges, when the time comes and that the election is fully adjudicated, Trump will be very willing to concede the election. And will do so, but that won't come until the legal process is exhausted. Just as in the case in 2000, when the shoe was on the other foot, that's exactly what Al Gore did. And if and when it gets to that point, Donald Trump will do the same thing.
Okay, let's then jump off the point that you'd raised before, and we'll get Ian and Minister Savage in again on this one. So now we've got Biden presidency, a reduced majority in the Democratic House, and probably about same as before in the Senate with the Republicans there. So let me ask you, Chris, you talked about this issue of do they have to now be more moderate? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to gauge what will happen when you've got both the White House as well as the House of Representatives in sync with each other. Does that embolden the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez squad and push them along the lines of the many, many green agenda items that Minister Savage outlined? Or do they take the lesson that, you know what, Americans just aren't interested in going there. They don't want to give up fossil fuels. And as a result, they have to be more moderate. They have to allow fracking. They have to allow the pipeline to get built. How do you see the midterm elections?
Let me be very brief here. With the Republican Senate, which is almost certain, Democrats have not won a Georgia runoff in 60 years. With the Republican Senate, none of these Green New Deal measures are going to become law. Zero. The Democrats in the House now have a close enough majority that two factions are going to be vying for leverage and control. One faction will be the Squad and AOC and hardcore socialists, and the other will be the moderate Democrats who barely escaped with their political life just a few days ago. They ran in suburban districts. They were told they were ahead. They outspent the Republicans 3 or 4 to 1, and they barely won. And they are in great jeopardy in 2022 because in the first midterm election of a party in power, that party tends to lose seats in Congress. As a result, you're going to have a mini civil war within the House of Representatives. You're going to have Joe Biden probably have mini deals with with key Democratic senators like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, which I would remind you is a fossil fuel state, and the Republicans if they want to get anything done. So we either have gridlock or we have small incremental policy deals, which will not dramatically affect the political or economic equation one way or the other. There's a reason the markets have gone up so much in the last few days. The markets sense gridlock. Gridlock is good for the markets because that's predictable, and it means there's not going to be radical change. So, the AOC is, of course, an extremely popular social media cultural figure, but her real power is 10 people, and they scare to death the rest of the Democratic caucus because there's a reason why Donald Trump got more Hispanic votes as a percentage than Ronald Reagan. It's because AOC's socialism and radicalism and political correctness scared a whole bunch of socially conservative Hispanics in Texas and Florida and other places into voting for Donald Trump and Republicans. The Democrats are not going stupid. They're going to recognize that they have a problem in their midst, and it's not moving to the left that they have to worry about. It's alienating more people with discussions about defunding the police. So I believe the Democrats are in a real dilemma, far more than the Republicans. And with the Republican Senate, the Democrats are going to have to settle for much less than they expected even a few days ago.
Before I leave you, John, let me just get you to comment then on Keystone XL, because he could cancel that presidential permit. And
he will.
He will.
Of course. But it will probably be as part of a larger package of negotiations with Canada. The environmentalists, of course, will demand their pound of flesh. So I have no doubt that eventually, several months from now, Joe Biden will take moves to that. And those will be challenged in court. And Joe Biden will also say that there'll be an appeal process, and Keystone Pipeline will probably be integrated with other issues between the Canadian government and the U.S. government. So Biden will have to pay his political dues to the environmental community, but they will be grudging, they will be half-hearted, and they will not be dramatic. And frankly, even under Donald Trump, Keystone was going to have a tough row to hoe with all of the court decisions and the environmental objections.
Oh my, let me just then get Minister Sonya Savage to respond to that, the Energy Minister for Alberta. That sounds ominous. I don't know if you want to sort of respond to what you heard John say there.
Sure. And we're following it very, very closely. And one of the things that maybe Americans don't realize, but in Canada, we have federalism, and the provinces own natural resources. We own those resources, and we have the exclusive constitutional authority to produce and develop them. So that hampers what our federal government can agree to internationally. So some of those things that might jump out and concerning what would be in a broader environment and energy package that Joe Biden might want to create with Canada, you have to look at the constitutional realities in Alberta. We're following the KXL very, very closely. Of course, we've got James Rajat on the ground in the United States. There's bipartisan support for the project. It's supported in every single state by the governors of every state that it goes through. We're following it extremely closely, and it's part of it's KXL has to be considered in a broader perspective than just energy and climate relations between our countries, but it's the whole trade relationship. It's a bigger package. It's trade. It's trade between Canada and the United States. It's not just a single pipeline. It's not just about energy. So we're looking at it in that context.
Okay, let me go back to Chris Butler and see if he agrees with John about these next 2 years, just because of the configuration being a period of moderation so that they don't lose ground in the midterms 2 years from now. Is that likely what we're to see? And what about getting the pound of flesh and satisfying that sort of more extreme Green New Deal element of their party? How do you see it, Chris?
Yeah, I agree completely. We are looking at gridlock, which is good, as John mentioned. I think the open question is how much Joe Biden will actually be managing things on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we didn't see a very active and aggressive campaign that was being run. The Democrat strategy was to just turn Joe Biden into the generic Democrat as best as they could, at least when we got to the general. And so I just wonder how much he's going to be operating things on a day-to-day basis, and whether it's going to be left to whoever is most interested in the subject matter at hand. And if that's the case, I think you'll see a much more radical shift to the left in terms of the administration and executive activity than some people are prepared for. I think that you saw with his negotiations with Bernie Sanders immediately following the Democrat primary that he's very willing to concede on policy. And when we get there, it's just an open question. Will we be dealing with the Joe Biden that the Republican Senate negotiated with in the teens on extending the Bush tax cuts? Or will we be dealing with the Elizabeth Warrens of the world and their agendas as they're placed into the administration? And I don't know the answer to that.
All right, let me, Ian, you've heard our two American analysts and how they anticipate the next 2 years going. Is it anything they said that you wanted to respond to?
No, just it'll be fascinating to watch unfold as a Canadian in Washington, and particularly the midterms. Very, very interesting.
Let me go back to John then and ask this question. Did Donald Trump ruin conservatism for everyone else, or did he save conservatism for everyone else by showing them the pathway to represent the union worker and bring that coalition into the conservative movement in a way that no one's been able to do before? What do you think?
We're going to be debating that question for years. Donald Trump clearly identified weaknesses in the Republican Party's coalition. The party had not spent enough time with the concerns of working class Americans. It had also, I think, had a somewhat blinkered view of immigration, dismissing people's concerns about immigration, even if it represented social unrest and increased crime along border communities. My brother is the deputy chief of police in Tucson, Arizona for many years. I'm very pro-immigration, but clearly the interests and concerns of many average Americans were ignored. So Donald Trump, I think, saw a political opportunity, a market niche, and he expressed it. He advocated for people who felt they had been forgotten, and he carried Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania the presidency in 2016. Two things happened with Donald Trump that I was wrong about. When he took office, I did not think he would be as conservative as he ended up being. He ended up both in regulatory issues and tax issues, and of course Supreme Court appointments, as being much more conservative than his Republican predecessors. Part of that is because in some of those areas he didn't have direct day-to-day interest or concern about, so he delegated that to others. And the second thing is I thought that the majesty, the power, the importance of the office of President of the United States would descend upon his shoulders and moderate his behavior and perhaps make it a little more acceptable to people who are used to a president, well, frankly, acting presidential, and that didn't happen. So I think the first strengthened Trump's political cause, and Americans for Tax Reform, I think, was very successful in working with Trump on that. And he helped himself. He helped himself to an incredibly powerful economy. You know, we have recovered 2/3 of the jobs we lost at the beginning of COVID. We've recovered 2/3 of the jobs we've lost in 6 months. It's an astonishing performance. But at the same time, Trump alienated many, many people, suburban women especially, who simply said, there's too much drama here, there's too much chaos, there's too much changing of someone's mind on the spur of the moment, there's too much shooting from the hip. And that did hurt Trump. If you look at the election results, Trump picked up support in many, many areas, but in key suburban areas, he fell below his showing against Hillary Clinton, and that did help cost him the election.
Okay, I think we've got about 7 minutes to go, and I want to get everybody to weigh in.
I'm going to have to jump off because of the pending news issues.
No problem.
I now have obligations that I did not expect to have.
John, you know what? We so appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here today. That was
Thank you.
Yeah, that was John Fund, who was able to join us with the National Review. Now let's continue on with the discussion because we'll get everyone else in to comment on this. Chris Butler, let me put this to you. One of my favorite podcasters is Dave Rubin, who describes himself as a California Reagan Democrat. He's gay, he's married, he voted for Donald Trump. And one of the things that he observed is he said the media only like conservatives, only like Republicans that are acquiescent to the things that they believe, and Republicans that will lose. And so this is why, I mean, we have John McCain, who is a bit lauded, and we now have Mitt Romney, who's the hero. So what should be the lesson of Donald Trump coming out of this? Should the next move for conservatives be to get somebody more acquiescent, someone who will expand the state but just do it more slowly, who won't upset the apple cart? Or should we learn that you actually can be pretty bold, but you can't be mean and you can't be rude? Like, how do you take it?
Well, I hope that you can get to a place where you have somebody that can be as active, can push as hard, can be as bold, without creating a reaction in terms of style, and acrimony that John Fund had mentioned. I mean, it always remained his biggest challenge that he was unable to act the ceremonial role as president as much as he needed to. And I think that was one of his big challenges in the first debate. If he had acted in the way that he did in the third debate, I think that it probably would have made a difference. How much of that, him being so brash was a part of his appeal? And could somebody have some of that appeal? I don't know. That's the big question, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the Republicans have to ask. But I think that there is a Trumpism that will be permanently brought into the Republican Party that centers around greater appeal to working people, whether it's whether it's white union voters in the upper Midwest, or whether it's new Hispanic, particularly Hispanic immigrants, but other immigrants as well, and black voters, particularly in the South. I mean, I don't know who 3 years ago would have guessed that Trump would have really expanded the map, particularly among minority voters, but he was able to do it. And it was, in part of it, a big part of it is cultural, rejecting cultural elitism. And I think that Republicans really need to take that piece to heart. There are going to be significant swaths of the cultural elite who are going to be horrified by anybody that takes any kind of that has a style that they find unacceptable in these areas, that didn't go to the right schools, or is bold enough to appoint a Supreme Court justice that didn't go to an Ivy League school. But hopefully there's some way that hopefully that you could split the difference.
All right, Chris, I'm sorry, I only have 3 minutes left, so I want to get our two Canadians to answer this question as well. We've got three models of three different Conservative leaders, successful in their own way, three different styles, but they seem to have learned the lesson of Donald Trump. I hear Aaron O'Toole talk about his dad's history working in the factory floor at GM. I see Doug Ford going and doing the press announcements with Jerry Diaz at his side and cozying up to Chrystia Freeland and showing that you can do bipartisan support. I see Jason Kenney cultivating the building trades and talking about the trades who are going to benefit from the construction of Keystone Pipeline. So I'm wondering if that's kind of going to be the enduring legacy of Donald Trump, is it kind of woke Conservatives up to see the fact that frontline, hardworking union guys and gals, they're our friends. Let me go to Ian Todd first.
Absolutely, and I could see that as I travel across the United States. It just was starkly evident. His appeal to, hardworking entrepreneurs, the common man and woman on the street was just remarkable.
Sonya, sorry, Minister
Sure,
Savage.
I agree too.
Yeah.
I agree too. We have to have a message of hope and optimism. We have to appeal to people who are worried about their jobs and their families, about keeping work, about being able to pay their mortgage. And I think that's where Conservatives have a strong message, and we have the strong leaders to actually bring in policies to realize that message. But hope and optimism and focus and fight for people's jobs. That's what people want.
Okay, you answered that faster than I expected. So let me do one last follow-up before we wrap it up. So Ian Todd, one of the ways in which I think that Conservatives still need to find a map forward is we're strong on the economy, but we haven't been able to get the young kids, the millennials, to buy into the balance on the green issues. Are you seeing any progress being made anywhere? Is there anything that we can learn from Donald Trump on that?
I would like to think so. We certainly need that young, bright minds, fresh thinking. We really have to concentrate on attracting that group.
Okay, Minister, you get the last word on that. You're at the forefront of it. I've been watching with some enthusiasm, talking about small-scale nuclear, talking about hydrogen, talking about carbon capture and storage. Is that going to make a difference? Is that going to tip the dial?
It absolutely is with young voters. They want to know that there's jobs and that there's a bright future and an economy for them, but they also want to know that it's going to protect the environment. And I think you're right. We're focusing not only on supporting our oil and gas sector, but new areas like geothermal, like small modular reactors, hydrogen, a mines and mineral strategy, things that are looking for a greener environment, things that will look towards lower emissions. And young people want to see that. They're insisting on seeing that, a green future, greener future.
All right, that's it for me on this panel. That was Minister Sonya Savage, the Energy Minister for Alberta. We have Ian Todd as well, who's Ontario's ambassador, representing Ontario's interests in Washington. And we've got Chris Butler, Americans for Tax Reform. We also heard from John Fund a little bit earlier today. He was with the National Review, but he had to cut out to go to a pretty important announcement. So we're going to take a pause. I'm going to hand it back to Troy Lanigan.